Hi, thanks for joining. Please make sure you subscribe to follow us on all the various platforms here on the podcast, as well as on YouTube. The stuff we write on Substack, as well as quick takes on Instagram and on Threads. If you're enjoying what we're putting out there, please make sure you're sharing with all your friends and family. And if you have questions or comments about the stuff we're putting out there, please make sure you leave them in comments to us. We'd be more than happy to cover them in future talks. I'm going to try my hardest not to make this into a political podcast, a political discussion, as relates to a lot of the misinformation and disinformation that is being spouted within the public health realm, within the health science realm, particularly from people who are in positions of power within the health agencies of the United States. Having that caveat out of the way, there is a lot of nonsense that's being spouted. There's a lot of nonsense being touted by people who are in positions of power overseeing our public health, overseeing our health sciences, that have led to a lot of resurgences of myths and misconceptions that have been disproven or have been shown to be untrue within the general population, where there may be some evidence to show that there is validity for use of some of the advice that's being given within specific populations and within specific conditions. Nonsense that gets picked up and published, leading to a lot of confusion that's out there. Whether in terms of the advice that we should be following, the advice that we should be disregarding, the advice that we should be ignoring. And so it leads us to needing to have a conversation about some of the myths and misconceptions that are out there and what we should be kind of holding on to without revisiting all of the previous discussions that we've had. Let's take a look at and let's discuss some of the nonsense that's being discussed within the public health realm as relates to some of the advice that's being given by people within positions of power in the United States as relates to our public health and our health science discussions.
Warning. The following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy.
If we look at a lot of the news stories coming out as relates to the ideas that are being spouted by the Health and Human Services within the United States about this desire by the secretary of that service to quote unquote make America healthy again, there is this push, there's this idea that somehow the food industry itself is trying to poison the people of the United States. That they're going to use chemicals that are going to have some sort of adverse health effect on us without actually explaining why they have their thoughts or what they are intending to do in order to alleviate what they see as the problem. They're simply just stating there's a problem there. And one of the things that we see in terms of stuff within the news, particularly stuff in terms of this movement that comes into play, is this idea about removing food dyes, about removing chemical toxins, about removing processed foods, that somehow we should go back to growing organic in terms of farms. The whole idea here is that the people of the United States are being exploited by the food industry, by the big agro corporations, where the idea that we get out of that were once grassroots movements, that somehow the food industry itself is exploiting families for profit, that are exploiting health for profit, that was the grassroots for a lot of the mob movements of the 70s and the mob movements of the 80s. That's the mindset that we have within this Make America Healthy Again, the MAHA kind of label that sprung from the Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Position, that somehow we are going to become healthy again as if we were somehow unhealthy before, or that we were healthier at an earlier point in time, or that we were being exposed to less nutritious things, that we were currently being exposed to more toxic things. The movement that we're kind of looking at here is building on this idea that we have this pandemic event of obesity issues, this pandemic event of overfatness issues, that we want to single-handedly lump into an idea that it has to deal with nutrition that is there. The problem is that there's no empirical evidence to support that it is strictly due to what people are consuming. And that's the root of the issue that we have to deal with when we start looking at this idea. Now, within that, there is some evidence to show that, yes, exposure to some types of things that are within foods may have an impact on our metabolism. And it goes back to something we talked about previously in terms of the ideas about foods having hormonal impacts, foods having metabolic impacts in terms of being an endocrine disruptor or being a metabolic disruptor. If they're going to have those impacts, if they're going to have an impact on our overall metabolic functions in terms of our overall metabolic health, in terms of this idea about the food additives, the processed foods, it has to have some sort of impact on us. It's going to have a change away from health and towards disease, away from low inflammation and towards inflammation, where we see foods being labeled as hormone-free. We see dairy products that are constantly being labeled as not having the specific types of hormones that we worry about in terms of hormones meant to help increase lactation within the dairy cows, to increase and help with growth of the animals. If we're looking at it in terms of meat, without understanding that the way in which hormones function is it's based off of pulse rates, what we call rhythms physiologically. And these rhythms, these pulse rates, are set up in such a way so that that we have waxes and wanes, we have increases and decreases of the hormones throughout metabolic functions. Where if we're not butchering the animal within a short window of time to exposure to, say, a growth hormone or to a steroid hormone in terms of increasing tissue growth, we're not going to see it in the sample. In terms of the dairy, we're not going to see the dairy containing the hormones in quantities that are going to have issues in terms of metabolism. There are some chemicals, there are some additives that we do see within foods that can have an impact. And this is where we start looking at some of the ideas about some of these quote unquote chemicals being dangerous, being the cause for obesity, being the cause for cancers, being the cause for nervous system issues, being the cause for quote unquote early puberty, being the cause for cardiovascular disease, being the cause for liver disease. With the exception of the puberty idea, the whole discussion that comes into play as relates to that MAHA idea about changing diet is about exposure to metabolic disruptors. And just like with every other thing, it's about dose and duration. That is, how much am I getting and how long am I getting it in terms of it having a negative impact. There are some things that we get exposed to that we would think are quote unquote healthy for us that are actually or can actually act as a metabolic disruptor. One of the things that we see in terms of treatment for people who have sugar imbalance, what people refer to as diabetes, is that they're going to be consuming other types of sugars that are supposed to help with sugar load, where the idea is that if we limit the total intake of sugar, we're going to somehow correct the diabetic issue. Even though the diabetic issue is not about sugar consumption, it's about hormonal signaling causing a reduction in use of glucose while sparing glucose for cells that need glucose in order to do their normal metabolic functions. And doing it in such a way that we have continuous, ever-growing levels of glucose within the blood that leads to part of the diagnosing for the diabetic issues, where it's not the fact that we have excessive amounts of sugar in the diet causing the diabetes, it's because of all of the inflammatory issues leading to a change in glucose utilization that's going to cause the diabetes. And this is where we look at the symptom as being the root cause for the disease, as opposed to looking for the root cause for the disease is causing the symptom. Within that idea, there is this idea that, okay, well, if we're going to have problems with using glucose, let's go ahead and let's use other sugars. Let's use things like fructose. Let's use things like sucralose. Let's use things like the other non-nutritive sweeteners that are out there. The problem with the fructose, particularly the way in which we usually consume fructose within the United States, is as what's referred to as a fructose syrup. Most people refer to it as a high fructose syrup. And whenever we say high fructose, what we're simply saying is that the percentage differences between normal sucrose and the fructose syrup. The difference between what we see in sucrose, which is a combination of glucose and fructose, and the high fructose is about a 2% change. That means we go from having a 50-50 split in between fructose and glucose to a 52-48 split in between fructose and glucose, making the sugar sucrose. And it's that swing that is going to be part of the root cause for having metabolic disruption. And part of that metabolic disruption will start within the gut in terms of digestion and processing of the sugar. But the other part of it is going to be within the body in terms of what fructose does at the tissues, in terms of triggering secondary metabolic responses, and the secondary metabolic responses causing some of the metabolic disruption that takes place. With the non-nutritive sweeteners, the sucraloses, the sugar alcohols, the stevia, the amino acid sweeteners, the aspartame, those are going to cause changes within our reception for sweet in terms of our taste, our perception of taste, that can lead us to overconsuming nutrients, and the overconsumption of nutrients leading to the nutrient imbalance towards the positive end, where if we're not at the correct level of activity, can lead to a increase in fat mass, hyperadiposity, and that hyperadiposity causing issues with our lipid metabolism, which leads to what's referred as dyslipidemia. That is an imbalance in lipid metabolism. That leads to inflammation, and that inflammation is going to lead to changes in the way in which we respond to regulatory hormones like leptin, like insulin, like ghrelin, like glucagon, like GLPs, which have, particularly the GLPs, which have gotten a lot of press over the last couple of years in terms of its somehow newfound weight loss capability, even though by itself, meaning that we don't do it in combination with other lifestyle changes, does not actually cause any type of body compositional change. And so when we start looking at those ideas in terms of what the non-nutritive sweeteners or what the non-glucose sweeteners are going to do, and we say non-glucose sweeteners, we're talking about the fructose sweeteners. What they're going to do is, yes, they're going to minimize the amount of insulin spiking that takes place. And by minimizing the amount of insulin spiking that takes place, we're going to have a change in a glycemic response. And by having a change in glycemic response, we may see a slow reduction in glucose levels, but that's in a short-term event. And it may not have long-term impacts in terms of having a beneficial impact, which is where when we start looking now, particularly at the animal models. There's not a lot of human studies that have looked at this, but there's a lot of animal studies that have looked at this, where we do not see any change in terms of correctness of metabolic issues coming out from the switch within sugars that are there. And even still, we end up getting an increase in adiposity, an increase in fat mass from the switch towards the increase in fructose within the diet. And that's because fructose, independent of any other of the other hormonal signals, causes lipid synthesis, making of lipids, but it also causes a change in inflammatory signals coming away from the gut based off of changes of the microbiome and its function within the gut, which is where people can state that, well, high fructose corn syrup is going to cause gastrointestinal changes, which is going to cause the change in metabolism, which makes it worse than regular sugar. But at the same time, we're going to use it in terms of fructose for people that have diabetes. And it's where we have to be very careful in terms of the evidence that we're looking at as to whether or not we can actually use the evidence that we have to stipulate that it's going to have problems for human physiology. And so we have that kind of issue coming into play here, and we look at this ideas about what types of foods that we want to try to quote unquote ban from the diet within the United States, based off of this whole MAHA idea, where we want to somehow change the foods that we're eating that's going to somehow change our health, based off of the faulty premise that our nutrition by itself is going to allow for improvements in health. There is a linkage that we do see in terms of environmental exposure to some of the things that we see in the environment with our health. But there's not the same type of evidence that we see in terms of exposure within the foods. And so what ends up happening is that we end up getting voices being amplified within social media. We get voices amplified within the political realm that discusses the need for changes in food regulations, and the changes in food regulations based off of some of the faulty analogies that we see within some of the foods. Now, there are some foods and there are some additives within foods that can become dangerous for us. And this is where, once again, let's look at the idea about dose and duration in terms of exposure. And this is where a lot of the MAHA activists want us within the United States to mirror what is taking place within Europe and within other areas around the world, where the US is going to allow for additives to the food supply that's not permitted in other places. And part of this has to deal with how the regulatory agencies were set up in the first place and how the regulatory agencies are going to be governing. Part of this has to deal with the level of scrutiny that comes into play as it relates to safety and what is going to be kind of accepted as safe versus harmful in terms of the additives, the products, the fertilizers, the pesticides that we see within the foods. Now, what's interesting is that even though a lot of the MAHA activists and the MAHA voices that we hear are talking about wanting to be organic, wanting to have GMO-free foods, they want to reduce the amount of pesticides, they want to reduce the amount of fertilizers. If we look at what we can get away from in terms of the fertilizer, the pesticide, the other things that they worry about, by utilizing genetically modified plants that do not need the amount of fertilizer, that do not need the amount of pesticides, we can eliminate some of the worries. And so what are some of the worries that we look at in terms of what we might see within food supplies, particularly for like fertilizers, like nitrates? If we look at the nitrates, we talk about issues in terms of environmental cost for nitrates. However, physiologically, nitrates have a positive impact. The nitrates have a positive impact physiologically. They reduce blood pressure. They improve heart functions. They have a reduction in inflammatory signals within the blood vessels. There is a noted relationship between nitrate and neuron functions, where we see improvements in cognitive performance. Musculoskeletally, we see an improvement in muscle force production. We see improvement in muscle strength. We see improvements in both slow twitch as well as fast twitch functions. We see an increase in endurance capacity within skeletal muscles. We see a reduction in metabolic disorders from nitrates. And so while nitrates have both a positive and a negative to it, most of the negatives that we see in terms of nitrates come about from cooking nitrates at very high temperatures, where we can see toxins come about from the cooking of nitrates at excessively high temperature. And those toxins come about due not strictly from the nitrates themselves, from the products that have the nitrates, but from the microbiomes producing secondary chemicals during the digestive process. We know that the nitrates can lead to that colorectal issue, but it's going to lead to the colorectal issues in terms of the cancer issues, not from the nitrates itself, but from how we go about digesting the nitrates, but more importantly, from how the microbiome is going to alter its responsiveness in terms of changing reactive oxidative species development. And that's mainly due to not just what's happening in terms of the nitrates, but also where we are consuming the nitrates within the food products, And this goes into the idea about the processed food, in particular ultra processed food, which I completely agree with the push to reduce the consumption of the processed food and the ultra processed foods within the diet that we have, because the processing itself causes metabolic disruptors to come into play. If we look at some of the fertilizers, the organophosphates and the glyphosates, the organophosphates are known to have inhibitory functions on some of the enzymes. Acetylcholine esterase will be inhibited. It can have an impact on mitochondria. It can have an impact on oxidative stress. It can lead to metabolic disruption through changes in PPARs, which are enzymes that are needed for aerobic metabolism and the breakdown of lipids. Same with the glyphosates. The glyphosates are going to increase oxidative stress. They're going to have a change in microbe functions within the intestines, which can lead to an increase in intestinal inflammation signals, which can lead to whole body inflammation signals based off of changes in immune cell function, which is a noted cause for metabolic dysregulation, anabolic dysregulation, and metabolic diseases. We know that we can have an interference with some neurotransmitter synthesis by having an impact on tyrosine as well as tryptophan metabolism, which can lead to issues that we might see in terms of dopamine and serotonin pathway. We know that there can be issues in terms of reproductive effects based off of some of the organophosphates, some of the glyphosates, as well as some of the phytosterols acting as estrogen mimics. And while it can have a protective effect in terms of cardiovascular benefit, in terms of reactive oxidative species and oxidative stress, by basically limiting how much oxidative stress is there, limiting how much vascular adhesions are taking place within the blood vessels, which is going to have a protective impact on blood vessel functions, it can have an impact on the production of red blood cells and can lead to anemic issues. It can have an impact in terms of reproductive cancers. There is a lot of hooey out there in terms of the estrogen mimics and its impact on puberty. There is no evidence to stipulate that it has an impact on puberty or have an impact on reproductive maturation. It does seem to have a small impact on potentiation for or potential for having reproductive cancer development, but it's not going to impact the changes that we might see in terms of developing early pubertal changes, or having early menstruation, or having early andropause issues, or having any changes in free levels of hormones. The one that got a lot of press is the bisphenol A, the BPA, that we see within some of the plastic products, where when we looked at BPA being injected directly into rodents, there was a drastic change in estrogen signaling, and that drastic change in estrogen signaling leading to issues of reproductive function. Same thing happens within the rodent studies, where they consumed nothing but BPA-laced fluids with the intention of it mimicking exposure to BPA in a natural world. But the problem is that's not how we get exposure to the bisphenols in terms of those issues. The same thing with the phytosterols. Phytosterols have benefits. They have metabolic benefits to them in terms of leading to a reduction in inflammation. But if we overconsume the phytosterols, we can actually trigger inflammation. We can block androgen responses, which can minimize tissue growth. We can have estrogen mimicking, which can, just like with blocking androgen, limit the amount of tissue growth. We know that the phytosterols and overexposure to phytosterols can have a deleterious effect, can have a dangerous effect on bone health, have a dangerous effect on lipid metabolism, have a dangerous effect on inflammation regulation, all of which can have a negative impact on my overall health based off of having a hyperestrogenification issue. And that hyperestrogenification issue leads to epigenetic modulation, changes in my normal genetic regulation that can have metabolic impacts, not just for myself, but for generations to come. And this is where one of the things that people are worried about in terms of this environmental exposure is that we're not just having issues within the generation, that is within the population that is living currently, but in the population to come, which is where we are having this push. It's a faulty push to try to find a current environmental toxin to explain exposure rates and incidence rates for neurological diseases, for metabolic diseases. We do know that there is changes that take place epigenetically to exposures within the environment that get expressed in subsequent generations. But it tends to be something that is epigenetically regulated, means it's regulated within the genes, that can get fixed within specific genes, such as what we see in terms of feast-famine cycling and the fatty acid oxidation genes that are associated with changes in lipid metabolism, that is associated with hyperadiposity, too much body fat, that is coupled with high sedentary behaviors leading to issues of overfatness, that we see in terms of changes in distinct types of responses to regulatory hormones, in particular regulatory hormones like insulin, where everybody talks about the insulin issues as it relates to glucose maintenance. But if we start looking at the same type of epigenetic modulation, this epigenetic change in terms of a lot of these fatty acid enzymes, we see changes in terms of responsiveness of insulin at other insulin receptors besides the insulin receptor that's going to be regulating the GLUT4 transporter that is going to be utilized when we are over-consuming glucose within a meal. And by over-consuming glucose, greater than 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram of body mass, greater than about a half a gram to about 0.7 grams per pound in terms of glucose consumption within a meal within 1 hour. And so most of us don't actually consume enough glucose within the sugars of the meal to actually have this insulin spiking that everybody's concerned about based off of glucose. But we do have changes that can take place due to not children, but grandchildren of individuals that have survived feast-famine cycles that lead to irregular responsiveness of insulin within tissues that is not related to glucose uptake, but is related to the other functions that insulin happens to have, such as growing tissues. Insulin is a great anabolic hormone. It's a great hormone to grow tissues. And we need some of that signaling within the cerebral cortex, within our brain, in order to get the neurons to grow, in order to keep the neurons healthy, in order to keep the connections between neurons healthy, to allow those connections between neurons to grow so that we're able to learn, so we're able to maintain the knowledge base that we have. So we do not have dementia issues, so we do not have forgetful issues. Where one of the things that we look at in terms of this epidemic of Alzheimer's issues, where the dementia seems to be related to people who have metabolic issues. And those metabolic issues tend to get lumped into people that have had chronic inflammation, that have susceptibility to diabetic issues, where one of the things that one of my family members have asked me is, how can we, as a family with known people with Alzheimer's issues, prevent becoming someone who has Alzheimer's? And I tell them, you have to be active. You have to be as physically active as you possibly can. And you have to watch out for triggering things that are going to cause inflammation, such as consuming excessive amounts of fructose, such as over-consuming glucose within meals, things that we know are going to trigger inflammation so that we can have normalized responses, because we used to think that Alzheimer's came about due to an inflammatory response from irregular protein formations within the areas around the neurons, to understand that it has more to do with inflammation and reactive oxidative species development. Where if we're able to minimize the reactive oxidative species, we're able to minimize the development of the Alzheimer's issues that can come into play. And so one of the things that we look at in terms of this idea about the MAHA, in terms of limiting the food additives, limiting the ultra processed foods, it's the idea is if we can minimize that exposure, we're able to reduce the risk for developing reactive oxidative species and reduce total oxidative stress. It's one thing and it's one of the few things that I agree with when they're talking about some of this quote unquote "Make America Healthy Again" idea. It's not that we were healthier earlier. We weren't. It's the fact that we're changing the diseases that we have to worry about. And this is where we have to be very careful in terms of, okay, so I agree with you on this, which means I must agree with you on everything, and that's not how things work. One of the other things that comes into play when we start looking at this idea about the nutrition ideas and the medicine ideas and the idea about trying to be healthy, and a lot of the movements that are taking place across the United States, is this state by state kind of push in order to align health bills with the whole idea about MAHA, about this idea that we're going to somehow make America healthy again. And the problem with this is that it doesn't align with how to actually deal with non-communicable diseases. You cannot legislate away non-communicable diseases. You cannot say, okay, we're going to get rid of all of the food additives that have metabolic disruptive issues and have endocrine disruptive issues, which is why I'm all in favor for the removal of the synthetic or the artificial food dyes, because they come from hydrocarbons, petroleum-based chemicals, and those petroleum-based chemicals are a known metabolic and endocrine disruptor. And because they're a known metabolic and endocrine disruptor, they are going to have a negative health impact on the individual that we have to be very careful of. And so even though that whole idea about the natural food additives, the natural food dyes being healthier, it's not always healthier in terms of this idea that we have to somehow become excessively health conscious in order to be always healthy. What we have to remember is that we have to follow a holistic approach. This holistic approach within medicine has taken two kind of paths. One path has become what some people refer to as a functional medical approach, and the other is what's referred to as a holistic medical approach. And yes, you can understand my disdain for the idea about functional in terms of this medical approach here, because what is functional? Functional is nothing more than holistic. It's simply just another term for holistic approach. When we look at holistic approach, the idea here is to look at all the factors that come into play that may have an impact on my overall health, which includes things like lifestyle, but it also includes things like my genealogy, it includes my genetics, it includes my environment, it includes all of the other factors. But what ends up happening within a lot of the scoping of this holistic approach and the scoping of this functional approach is that they ignore the holistic side of it, which means that they white coat the treatment. They do not involve the patient. They do not involve the person in terms of the selection for what they're going to do in terms of the treatment. They do not look at what is the preference for the individual. They do not look at what type of familial factors come into play. They don't look at all of the factors that I've been talking about in my research since the early 2000s about what actually comes into play as it relates to making somebody healthy, what actually comes into play as it relates to overall health. And this is where we have to look at what is the genetic issue, what is the metabolic issue, what is the physiological issue, what is the familial issue, what is the environmental issue. We see a lot of diseases within families, and we will automatically want to say, oh, it's genetic. We see a lot of diseases within distinct areas, and we'll say, oh, it's environmental, without understanding that is a confluence of various factors all come into play. It's a whole host of factors. It's a multifactorial issue. A lot of the non-communicable diseases that do not spread from person to person like a virus, all these non-communicable diseases come down to metabolic changes, metabolic disruption. That metabolic disruption leads to homeostatic and feedback dysregulation. And that feedback dysregulation leads to anabolic dysregulation. And that anabolic dysregulation leads to poor tissue maintenance. And the poor tissue maintenance is what's going to cause diseases to set into play, or diseases to come into play. And so when we start looking at this idea, okay, how can we actually make healthy again? It's not about making healthy again. It's about understanding how to go about setting up the selection process to allow people to make good choices and avoid bad choices, to inform people about what is a good choice and inform people about what is a bad choice, and allow them to understand the difference between the two. This is where if we start looking at, okay, what is the functional doctor going to do? What is the functional medical practitioner going to do? They're going to, quote unquote, work holistically, considering the full picture of the physical, mental, emotional, and quote unquote, spiritual health of the individual. Where they're going to focus on, quote unquote, patient-centered care, where they're going to try to look at and learn about your lifestyle and your medical history and your family history. This sounds like how every doctor should be practicing. But it ends with this. In order to find a solution to your health problems, it's where they're trying to pigeonhole a treatment plan based off of what they think is best, as opposed to bringing in the individual, as we've talked about, in terms of coercion versus self-selection, in terms of treatment for issues related to overfatness, related to sedentary behaviors. We want to identify and want to address the root cause for a lot of the health problems here. The problem with that is that there's too much intrinsic bias that takes place that is overtly and implicitly put into play based off of biases that I hold, that you hold, that your healthcare professional holds, in terms of how to go about treating diseases through lifestyle modification, because that is what this whole idea about MAHA happens to be. The nonsense that comes out of the MAHA movement is not about the non-communicable diseases. The nonsense tends to be about the communicable diseases and the blatant disregard that they have towards vaccinations and public health awareness towards communicable diseases. But at the same time, there is this overt need to have confirmation bias within the selection of evidence, as well as the expression of evidence, to back up what they think is best, without looking at the totality of the information. And one of the things we have to always remember whenever we start looking at this totality of information is looking at what is the scientific consensus about the chemicals, about the nutrients, about the food, about the way in which the food is being processed, about the type of exercise that is being done, which goes into a whole other discussion in terms of, should I do interval training? Should I do long, slow training? Should I do resistance training? Should I do what is now being called Metcon, which is metabolic conditioning, which is nothing more than the stuff that we've been talking about since we first started writing on, but since I first started writing on this continuum of fitness and fatness within health, where we have to look at what is the metabolic condition that we're trying to train to. And if it's about being healthy, then we have to train in order to have high degrees of metabolic flexibility, low degrees of inflammation, so that we're able to meet everyday challenges, where if it's something that is not for just everyday health, but is for trying to be stronger, trying to be faster, trying to be able to run for longer periods of time, training for that, where the what's missing within the discussion within that metabolic conditioning idea is the periodization that needs to take place within the exercise to allow for the correct conditioning to take place, so that we have the correct said principle being followed, so we have the correct challenges to homeostasis and the correct challenges to feedback regulation that allows for adaptations to take place, that allows for the body to become stronger, for the body to become more endurance, so it's able to be healthier and able to do things at a higher rate and a higher intensity than it was previous. When we start looking at this idea in terms of the food discussions that take place, in terms of should I be using vegetable oil or should I be using beef tallow for cooking? Should I be using processed foods? Should I be eating raw organic foods? That debate is something that cannot be held in a vacuum. It's something that we have to look at, once again, the totality of the scientific consensus. And one of the problems, particularly when we start looking at the dietary stuff, and this is something that we published on, that is in the Dogmatic Diets book, where you can't have a discussion about this if you're going to hold on to your diet as being the one and only diet to follow, where you can't have the discussion about what is the benefit, what is the cost, what is the positive, what is the negative to the dietary restrictions, to the dietary intake that takes place within. And part of that discussion goes into some of the laws that we're seeing in terms of the laws that are coming into play in terms of removal of the artificial dyes. But at the same time, it goes into the removal of the sugared sodas, or the idea that we have to not have sugared sodas, but have functional sodas. And once again, I don't like this word functional soda or this functional drink, because it's not functional. All they're doing is just changing one thing for another thing, like we talked about previously, in terms of are the alternatives even healthier? And they're not. They're not any more or less healthy than what they're trying to replace. And so when we start looking at the laws that are coming into play and the backing that they're getting from the current administration in terms of this idea about gaining or losing, about improving or restricting, all of the laws that we're seeing come into play, all of the restrictions that we have, and that's with ignoring the idiocy of the removal of the fluoride from public water sources. There are a number of research studies that have shown that it's had deleterious effects on dental health. Even if we do have fluoride exposure within the toothpaste, within the mouthwashes, people do not follow the cleaning instructions for those products to allow for the fluoride to have a positive impact in terms of the rate of exposure and the length of exposure that's necessary to allow for the fluoride to become embedded within the fluoryl hydroxyapatite that is necessary to maintain the tooth health that is there. If you would like to know more about that, please let me know. I'll be more than happy to go into detail on those studies. But we have to be careful about just falling in line with the fact that, it's the political party that is in charge, and I like that political party that's in charge, and I'm going to back the ideas that are being spouted by the people that are in charge, because there is nonsense that is being spewed. It's not all the time, but there is nonsense being spewed. And we have to be very careful about following the nonsense, following the quackery that is there, buying the quackery, buying the gimmicks that are there, because it can lead to health issues that we do not have, or we did not intend to have to deal with, whether they are going to be for myself or for future generations. Well, thanks for listening. Hope we got a bit out of the conversation as it relates to some of the continuous nonsense that we might see in terms of the Make America Healthy Again movements that we see across the country. If you have comments, please leave them. We're more than happy to discuss them in more detail. Please make sure you're giving us that big 5-star rating, that big thumbs up, telling us to know that we're doing a good job. Please make sure you're following us here on the podcast as well as on YouTube. The written stuff in Substack, as well as the quick takes that we post onto Threads and onto Instagram. Stay tuned for more discussions as relates to how we can go about using scientific knowledge to make ourselves healthy, to improve our lifestyles, as well as try to counterbalance some of the misinformation and disinformation that we see throughout a lot of the media feeds.